Good morning, dear conference speakers and our guests. We welcome you at the second day of this conference, the conference of the Ukrainian Association for Jewish Studies, Revealing of Secrets, Hasidism and Haskalah in the Ukrainian Lands. So this is the beginning of the second day, and I am highly honored to introduce our keynote lecturer, who is Professor Shmuel Feiner. Just a few words about our lecturer. Shmuel Feiner is a professor of modern Jewish history at Bar-Ilan University and heads the Samuel Brown Chair for the History of the Jews in Germany, and also heads the Historical Society of Israel. He is the author of Haskalah and History, the Emergence of a Modern Jewish Historical Consciousness, the Jewish Enlightenment, winner of the Koret Jewish Book Award, and Moses Mendelssohn, as well as of various articles on the Haskalah in Germany and Eastern Europe and on secularization. Am I right, Professor Feiner? So, the title of your lecture is The Perplexed of the Time, the Conservative Turn in the 19th Century Haskalah. So please welcome.
Thank you. First, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there with you in the Ukraine, in Lviv. I've never been there. Hopefully there will be other opportunities when the world will come back to normal. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that, okay. Yeah, you can see that I'm going to talk about the conservative turn in the 19th century Haskalah, and let me start with one moment. Let me start with our bigger hero in this conference, the revealer of secrets, Yosef Perel. In the historical context of the Haskalah movement, the 13th letter in the 1836 Bohomoltsia St by Yosef Perel is truly amazing. The author of Megalet Mirin, Ovadia ben Ptachia, actually Yosef Perel himself, artificially constructs a public opinion that supposedly reacts to the revolutionary book that exposes the disgraceful behavior of the Hasidim. But the book contained some self-criticism. The despised, backward sect is not the sole victim of Perel's satire, but surprisingly, the modern Jews themselves. In a cultural sociological analysis of the large, prosperous community of Brody, about 16,000 Jews in the 1820s out of a population of 18,000, Perel sets apart not only the Maskilim who really hate us, the Hasidim, because in their eyes we are worshippers of Baal, may the All-Merciful protect us, but also another group, which is no longer a minority, and lacking any other definition for what he regards as an inferior hybrid phenomenon. He calls them in Bohomoltsia St simply people, briot. These are the pseudo-masculine, the false, the falsche masculine, the true masculine, or a troubled understanding where these Jews had emerged from, gave them a bad name. They say they were superficial, lacking any basis in the world of the Haskalah, but full of a sense of self-importance, outwardly appearing to be progressive, cultured European. This was an unorganized Haskalah, not necessarily oriented towards Hebrew culture. Perel, displaying a conservative position, sharply criticized them as well. The people, Briot of Brody, are only one group out of huge pool into which the Jews of Europe in general and of Galicia in particular had fallen in the first decades of the 19th century. Revolutionaries and reactionaries, modernists and orthodox, proto-nationalists and those aspiring to integration, all mingled in the post-Napoleonic age, and it changed the face of the Haskalah. Some of the more prominent among the spokesmen of the Haskalah movement, including, for example, Shalom Cohen, you can see him in the middle, the reviver of Amehasef and the founder of the Hebrew journal Bikurei Haitim, Solomon Yehuda Rapoport, Shir, and Samuel David Luzzatto, Shadal, invested much effort to give some meaning to the path taken by that turbulent modernization, which was so full of contradictions. There was the young maskil, Yoshua Eshel Shor from Brody, who developed into one of the most bitter, radical and anti-clerical members of the Galician Haskalah. Like Perel, in an article in Philipson article, a periodical Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums of the 1838, he divided Galician Jewry into clearly labeled groups: scholarly orthodoxy, Hasidic orthodoxy, the enlightened were ultra-liberals, and the enlightened were pseudo-maskilim. You can see here pseudo-Aufgeklärte. This is in the original German. And whose free thinking and lifestyle, he believed, merited condemnation. They caused damage to the Enlightenment, he argued in this article from 1838. Perel was not alone in this criticism of the modern Jews. So what has happened in those crucial years of perplexity and change? In order to understand it, we should start with an unexpected collapse of the Haskalah in Berlin. The rapid and astonishing decline of the Berlin Haskalah at the end of the 18th century was now no doubt a great surprise. The failure of the Haskalah can serve as one of the essential yardsticks with which to assess the nature of the process of modernization in the Berlin community at the turn of the 18th and 19th century. In modern perspective, it is becoming more and more apparent that the Haskalah offered only one channel out of many for Jewish modernization. And now, those of you who attended the wonderful talk by Professor Marcin Wójcicki yesterday, you can hear in in this sentence a kind of a comment on his lecture. So let me say it again. In modern perspective, it is becoming more and more apparent that Haskalah offered only one channel out of many for Jewish modernization, a channel that was appropriate for only a few Jewish men who displayed an intellectual interest in science, literature, education, and philosophy. In 1820, when David Caro sent his literary hero, Amitai ben Aviada Achitzedek, from provincial Poznan through Warsaw to the city of Berlin in search of Aufklärung, he was already directing him to post-Maskilic Berlin. At first, the Polish young Maskil Amitai was intoxicated by the freedom the Berlin Jews enjoyed and by the high culture. But Caro, the leading figure in the Poznan circle of Maskilim from the second decades of the 19th century, was also conscious of the radical social and cultural changes that many of Berlin's Jews had undergone since the time of Mendelssohn and Vesely in the previous generation. It does not conceal his sense of dissatisfaction with the Jewish Berlin of 1820. And surprisingly enough, he is as critical of its values and patterns of behavior as if he were an Orthodox preacher, rebacking the society for its sins against the Almighty, rather than a radical critique condemning its conservatism. לזאת הכי תראה, רבים העוזבים אורחות יושר. And you can read the text in the Hebrew, but let me read the translation. For here, my brethren, you see many abandoning the path of honesty and lacking in religion and morality, who think themselves to be wise men. Seeing this, the hearts of the righteous suffer. Then, in all times, we were oppressed. Heavy burdens were laid upon our backs, and with all our might, we struggled to reach the shores of wisdom. Now, we go free and lax. Today, the people of Israel call out, rise up, eat, drink, dance, and celebrate. For this is our festival of liberation, Chag HaChofesh, a wonderful phrase. And they pay no heed to the wise man who stands in the corner of the house with a furious face, saying, be aware. Ishamru lachem. This pessimistic observation by the maskil, the wise man, who furiously calls upon his readers to be aware of the blinding light of freedom and to reject hedonism, religious permissiveness, and radical acculturation, is characteristic of the conservatism and caution of the Haskalah movement in the generation I would term post-Maskilic Berlin. With the decline of the Berlin Haskalah, the city's power to attract Maskilim was diminished. It no longer served as a cultural center for those seeking to carry on the legacy of the Haskalah and to nurture the Hebrew language. From this stage, the trend was reversed. Some Maskilim left Berlin in search of other, more convenient places for the Haskalah. Others, who were already in the periphery, in any case, invested their efforts in forming a small, cohesive circle of Maskilim, for whom the old Berlin of the 1780s, for example, was still a source of ideal inspiration. The Maskilim who left Berlin were the connecting links that passed on the torch of Haskalah to the 19th century, but at the same time reshaped its messages. In this process, three mediators, natives of Poland, played a decisive role. There were Menachem Mendel Levin, Yuda Leib Ben Ze'ev, and the most important of the three, Shalom HaKohen, who was born in the Poznan district and lived in Berlin for more than 10 years as a religion and Hebrew teacher in the Freischule, the first modern Hebrew school, and at the same time began to publish poetry in Hebrew language textbooks. HaKohen first met the Maskilim of Berlin in the years of their decline. But unlike them, he believed in the Haskalah's power of regeneration. He attempted to revive a Me'asef, which was published under his editorship in Berlin in 1808, backed by a new organization, Chevrat Oavei Leshon Ivrit, the Society of the Lovers of the Hebrew Language, which replaced Chevrat Shocharei Tov Atushia from the previous generation. The glue that bound the members in his Maskilic society was different from that which had bound those of the previous generation. It was primarily a counter-reaction to the religious crisis of the community and not the motivation to change the face of traditional society. As HaKohen described the members of the society, we all love God and his true Torah, and none of us has anything whatsoever to do with those who turn their backs upon the words of the living God. The next two volumes of the Revive Ameasef were already printed outside of Berlin, in Altona, Breslau, and Dessau. Then, in around 1812, a Cohen embarked on his travels, which took him through Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Hamburg, and London, apparently in search of an attentive audience that would show interest in his moderate configuration of the Haskalah. In 1820, he obtained a position in Vienna as a proof reader in Anton Schmidt's printing house, and there initiated the publication of a new periodical, Bikurei Haitim. This mediator of the Berlin Haskalah now became the most important figure in this generation of the Haskalah. With the new periodical serving as a focal point, he organized the Maskilim throughout the Austrian Empire and via correspondence established networks between local circles and individual Maskilim. A Cohen also demonstrated his commitment to maintain some continuity with the Berlin Haskalah by printing issues of Ameasef as a supplement to his Bikurei Haitim. In doing so, he was acquainting the new generation of Maskilim with the major work of the earlier generation and convincing them that they were following their footsteps. When Shalom Cohen was engaged in his ambitious venture of reviving Ameasef after a lapse of 11 years, he reflected the emergence of a post-Maskilic conservative worldview that was taking shape in the light of the threats of secularization and the dominance of the sweeping European culture. As he wrote in 1808 in his programmatic introduction to the new Ameasef, this time the major aim was to pave a middle way between the extremes, a search for a third path in Jewish culture. It's very precise words, and with your permission, I'll read it in the original German. Der neue Sammler soll nun durch die literarische Beschäftigung mit jener alten ehrwürdigen Sprache und ihre heiligen Schriften die Religion eine Stufe zum Mittelpunkt wieder zurückführen und dadurch das Gleichgewicht vielleicht wiederherstellen. Putting religion back in the center. This is a most important and dramatic declaration of the Maskil in early 19th century in this post-Berlin phase of the Haskalah. Cohen was not alone. Outside of Berlin, particularly in Breslau and Dessau, there were circles of teachers who also wanted to preserve and nurture the legacy of the Haskalah. The Hebrew printing houses in Breslau and Dessau preserved for a few more years the Haskalah culture. The educational activity and literary creation of teachers in the new schools of Breslau and Dessau was intensive. And there was even one attempt to restore Berlin to its former status when Yirmiyahu Einemann and Moshe Bishenthal printed an open letter calling for the publication of an anthology that would preserve the best of the classics of the Berlin Haskalah. They believed that the crisis that had struck the lovers of the Hebrew literature and language had already passed, and that the Haskalah could be rejuvenated. David Sorkin has already drawn attention to this remarkable activity of teachers in Germany in the post-Haskalah generation, at the time when Jewish hopes for political emancipation were growing, and has rightly argued that we ought to take note of how, in their case, the Haskalah changed and its fundamental position, which was cultural and ideological, was converted into an ideology of emancipation. However, it is also correct to add an additional element to this major motivation. There were those among the teachers who kept in mind not only the opportunities for emancipation, but also the high price to be paid for the emancipation by Jewish culture and religion. A forgotten family play, Toar Azman, published by David Zamosh in 1821, provided an interesting and direct testimony to the conservative turn. In this play, a young fellow returns from the big city, probably Berlin, where he had been studying medicine, and now, to his traditional father's great displeasure, is beginning to neglect the observance of the commandments, mocks the Hebrew language, and spends his time in pubs, eating non-kosher food in the company of Gentiles, and dreaming of introducing organ music and a service in German into the synagogue, influenced by early reform movement in Germany. His sister is attracted to the pleasures of bourgeois life, to music and theater. Earlier days were better than these, says the father, whose heart is broken by his children's rebellious ways. We love the Almighty, and he gave us light by night. Now is the time of trouble for the tribe of Jacob. One moment, I'm staying with David Zamosh. Even his wife is supportive of his children's acculturation and is opposed to her husband's desire to marry off their daughter to a Talmudic scholar. Instead, she encourages her to marry a handsome young man of wealth who dresses in the European fashion, plays a musical instrument, and speaks French and German. The slim plot ends surprisingly with the son's recognition that his father is right. His return to the traditional, stable patterns of life, to a marriage acceptable to all concerned, and to a family reconciliation. A very naive family play, but still an interesting historical document. The conservative message of Zamoch was very clear, and it is easy to see that in his play, there is barely a trace of Maskilic criticism. In the post-Maskilic period, those teachers, like Zamoch, who was a teacher in Breslau, who felt they were responsible for shaping and educating the young generation in the midst of rapid modernization, no longer represented the Maskilic struggle, but rather the desire to save what existed in the face of destructive aims that they perceived to be threatening Jewish identity. Turning back to Galicia, perhaps more than any of the others, it was a contemporary of Joseph Peretz, the philosopher Nachman Krochmal of Zsolkve, who realized that those turbulent times of early 19th century presented the Jews with great challenges, and he attempted to give it significance and meaning. As in the case of Peretz, this awareness of change and crisis marked the conservative shift in the Haskalah movement. Krochmal was particularly sensitive to the intensity of the change and its far-reaching implications. The old world was collapsing, being replaced by a new world that was tempting and promising, and yet frightening and threatening at the same time. With heightened sensitivity, Krochmal and others registered the strong fluctuations of change, tried to decipher their meaning and to predict the direction they would take, and mainly tried to arouse the Jews of their time to open their eyes and prepare themselves for life in a changing world. This consciousness of the turbulent time that inspired Krochmal to write his monumental work, More Nevuchei Hazman, and I would like to elaborate on this point. I will not deal with the work itself, but I will attempt to provide an historical explanation for another short text that appears in a letter sent by Krochmal in 1836 to Shadal to Luzzatto in Padua. In it, he sent him a few excerpts of the book that cast light on his purpose in writing it. And he said the following in this letter to Shadal. And here in these recent times, when we have experienced everything, words of blessing and words of curses, both temporal and spiritual. Not only have there been many changes in different times, but also at one time in the change of places and in the upheaval in the lands of our dispersal. And where can one find the means for speaking but one tongue and infusing many things in our hearts that are accepted by all? By the Italian Jew, the Oriental Jew, by the professed intellectual of Ashkenaz, and the professed pious of the kingdoms of the north. Nevertheless, he continued, despite the distance between them in local and in views, there is a connection between them. They know one another and hate one another, and each sect claims that if the other were like them, then the righteousness would be imminent and the redemption would be revealed. And for us, sitting as we are in the middle and seeing what is taking place and what is being said from right and from left, we find it apt to say, it is time for the Lord to act, for they have made void thy law from every side, Kochmal emphasized. If one listened attentively to Kochmal's word, the intensity of his consciousness of change is evident. They also reveal his awareness of the dynamics of modernization taking place rapidly and stormy, and testify to the growing weakening of the links that until then had unified the Jews. In the dichotomic division of the camps among the Jewish people in the early 19th century, he observes a wall arising between right and left. He identifies the Maskilim who share his worldview as those who share his consciousness of crisis caused by the time. They also share his sense of confusion, but are capable of listening to everyone and adopting a middle of the road position. In this map of Kochmal's, there is a little doubt as to the identity of the right wing. His letters and the book itself are replete with outspoken polemics against Hasidism, which can easily compete with the words used by Perel and others. Hasidism, the movement which he, like his fellow members of the Haskalah in Galicia and Russia in those years, saw as a vulgar and dangerous distortion of the religion. But what was the identity of the left? Who is the adversary on the left side of the battlefield whose boundaries Kochmal sketch, and why are they perceived as a threat? When Nachman Kochmal was born in 1785, Moses Mendelssohn was still alive and renowned. Ameasef was being published a second year. The Republic of Maskilim had begun to organize. Modern schools were established in Prussia and in the Austrian Empire, and the first echoes of the Haskalah had also reached Galicia. We should not forget that some of the outstanding and most prolific Berlin Maskilim, such as Yitzhak Alevi of Satanov, Mendelefin, and Aaron from Yaroslav, arrived in Germany from Poland, from Galicia. The Enlightenment revolution of the Haskalah was inspired by the new consciousness of the significance of historical time. The desire to respond to the challenges of modern age in Europe, to establish new educational system, to criticize the rabbinical leadership, to instill the values of humanism and religious tolerance. All these were founded on the awareness of an historical shift. One can rightly say that the Maskilim invented the modern Jew by inventing the modern time as an age that substantially differed from the one that preceded it in the old world. A new age that embodied endless opportunities for improving the lives of people in general and the Jews in particular. Its great optimism generated an enormous motivation to participate in the great projects of change. The Maskilim considered the rabbinical elite to be the obstacle to change, since it held the monopoly on knowledge and guidance of the public. It viewed the Maskilic elite as a threat to its status and authority. of Haskalah and protested against the Maskilic slogan that the times had changed and the Jews ought to prepare for challenges of the new world. The process of Nachman Krochmal's cultural conversion, I would say, began when he was in his teens and led him from the old Beit HaMidrash to the Haskalah, and in particular distance him from Hasidim. At that time, however, at the turn of the 18th century, the Haskalah movement in Berlin was already facing a profound crisis, as I've just described. He himself and other young Maskilim from Eastern Europe knew nothing about the crisis, and only a few felt its effects. In actual fact, as we have seen earlier, the movement had crumbled, its organizational framework was dismantled, and its prominent members had dispersed. That crisis in Berlin at the turn of the century was not the result of the victory of the rabbinical elite that opposed the Haskalah from the right, but surprisingly enough, it was actually the growing strength of the left on the scale of Jewish modernization that led to the defeat of the Haskalah movement. The momentum and intensity of the processes of secularization, which did not follow the path of the Haskalah project, but rather that of acculturation, religious apathy, and criticism, increased considerably. This is how Mendeleev described the situation. The general passion for innovation hasn't heartbeats, but among the majority, it takes a downward turn to negative directions. The despicable, fastidious Jews deride the respectable Orthodox, the elderly, the Talmud, and the religion. People go over to deism and religious apathy. Levy noted with sorrow that walls were being erected between the camps, and many were ashamed of their origins, of their Jewish names, of their brethren, and their self-respect as Jews. Maskilim who did not hesitate to scornfully criticize the traditional society cautioned now against the implications of the breakdown of the family and the abandonment of tradition. The crisis, with all of its extreme manifestation, was, in their view, a product of the drastic pendulum-like movement between adherence to the traditional strict norms observed with incomprehensible zeal on the one side, and absolute licentiousness along with the severance of all ties to family, religion, and morality on the other. At this historical point in time, we can notice the beginning of the conservative shift in the Haskalah movement. In light of the challenge posed by the rapid trends of modernization that left the Haskalah project cultural innovation behind, the Maskilim began to attack not only anti-Maskilic religious fanatics, but also the religiously lax and superficial Maskilim, like those Briot people of Brody, who showed no interest in fostering Hebrew culture. In the first decades of the 19th century, the process of secularization intensified, and teachers, educators, preachers, modern rabbis, authors, journalists, and scholars of Judaism reacted strongly with the aim of resolving the crisis and its grave consequences for the image of the Jews, morality, and the preservation of Jewish identity. The remedy, they believed, lay in the religion. The reshaping of the religion to adapt it to aesthetic criteria, to the demands of life and the ideology of emancipation, and education focused on principle of faith that preserve the pure core of Judaism, all these were at the center of the plans for religious reform. These were the issues around which the major polemics in 19th century Germany Jewry revolved. In the 1830s, echoes of the crisis reached Nachman Krochmal and left a profound impression on him. In that same letter to Luzzatto, he viewed his contemporary as men looking at a world that had undergone such enormous turmoil that it seemed history had come to an end. As he put it, in these very last days, when all things possible have happened to us. This is Europe after the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the the initial steps of emancipation, the political and the ideological struggle between liberalism and conservatism, the beginning of the movement for religious reform, the counter-struggle of the Orthodox, and nearer home, the dizzying spread of the Hasidic movement. How is it possible to build a bridge between the professed intellectual of Ashkenaz and the professed pious from the kingdom of the north? Krochmal asked, profoundly conscious of the deep schism that had opened between the Jews of Germany and those of Eastern Europe in his own time. He viewed Hasidism as the threat from the right that was undermining the true faith and distorting the true religion. But he saw as no less threatening the pseudo-intellectual of Ashkenaz on the left. This is the key to understanding Moreh Nevuchei Hazman and the significance of Haskalah shift to conservatism. Also in close touch with Krochmal was Shmuel Yehuda Rapoport, Shir, who was harassed by the Orthodox at the end of the 1830s when he was chosen with Pearl's support to serve as the rabbi of the Tarnopol community. He encouraged him in his struggle against extreme orthodoxy and shared with him his policy of moderate research in Jewish studies. In 1838, he said that he felt it was particularly important to remain separate from the radical critical study of Judaism, where nothing was off limits, practice, for example, but the historian Marcus Jost of Germany. Luzzatto, Chagall, a bitter rival of Jost, went even further than all the rest. From his place of residence in Italy, he played a key role in the Republic of Scholars and Maskilim, most of whose members were in Galicia. From Padua, he attempted to guide them all, including Krochmal, on how to embark on a path of counter-Haskalah that would block the rationalistic criticism that threatened to dismantle traditional Judaism, in his view. In particular, he held that it was urgent to halt the exaggerated absorption of alien cultures and values, everything that Luzzatto placed under the heading Atticismus, Greek culture. Judaism is the true source of civilization, he claimed. Jerusalem, the spring of justice, equality, and fraternity. Krochmal, who admired Luzzatto, did not always see eye to eye with him, especially when he criticized Maimonides for having introduced Greek philosophy into Jewish culture. However, fear of the threat from the left vexed all the members of this group, Perel, Rapoport, Shaw, Luzzatto, and Krochmal. These Maskilim were attentive to events in Germany, were all acquainted with the new trends in philosophy and historical research, and maintained close contact with the prominent Jewish culture. They were aware, for example, of the publication of the young rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's work, 19 Briefe, the 19 letters, in 1836. In it, he raised questions about Jewish identity in an age of secularization and viewed it as a serious problem that stood in the way of transmitting the Jewish tradition from one generation to the other in all of Europe. After all, it is absolutely impossible to observe those laws of commandments meant for an entirely different time period. The sons cried out, and this was the greatest challenge for him and from others in the first half of the 19th century. The Galician Maskilim pinned a great hope on Sunz. In him, they hoped to find a kinder spirit who was as fearful as they were about the threat from the left. Solomon Goldenberg, for example, a maskil from Krochmal's circle, sought Sunz's advice about his son, asking whether he ought to study in Tarnopol, Galicia, or would it perhaps be better to send him to Berlin? Goldenberg, in fact, believed that there he would maintain Jewish identity and would be under the guidance of honest teachers. While in Galicia, the young intelligentsia of doctors and lawyers wanting to promote their career would leave the people and the religion and would devote themselves to foreign gods in the land. Again, another conservative skill expressing his concerns. A guide to the perplexed of our time, Moreh Nevuchei Hazman, like Pearl's Bochen Tzaddik, was written under the influence of the Great Schism. Fear of extremism in the right of Hasidism and extremism in the left of the secularization and the erosion of Jewish identity. Krochmal's cardinal objective was to propose an ideological platform that would to some degree preserve the solidarity that seemed to be crumbling, could serve as an infrastructure for a modern Jewish existence, could form a bridge across all the camps and create a common language. Zunz, who edited the book and published it in Lemberg, in Lviv, in 1851, was very conscious of the historical situation in which Krochmal had written. He also was conscious of the threat from the left that called for a conservative policy. In the publisher foreword, he wrote the following about the critical situation in which the author of Moreh Nevuchei Hazman found himself, and referred first, not by accident, to the threat from the left before the threat from the right. It draws attention not only to the extreme rationalists who despise the religion, but mainly to the group of acculturated Jews who are indifferent to the religion and seek the good life that the European 19th century offered to anyone who could pay. The same group that caused the masculine of that generation feel so helpless was growing even larger, he said. As he lifted his eyes, he talked about Krochmal, and saw that ignorance was burning, and from its smoke the land was sealed off and its inhabitants turned away, some to the religion and other to science. Some of those thought our ancestors were foolish and their disciple falsifier, and others imagined that their elders justified idolatry, and the majority would sell tradition and heritage for gold and silver. Krochmal should be understood within the context of the conservative shift of the Haskalah movement. Not only did he feel threatened by what he regarded as the inferior, distorted religious face of the Schwer Merai and Iberglauben in the form it had taken in Hasidism, full of devils, spirits, evildoers, and tzaddikim, and by the mechanistic religion composed entirely of strict observance of the commandments that turned the free man into what he calls a Negro slave. He was also gravely concerned about the rationalistic heresy in all its varieties and the total abandonment of religious practice. On the left side of his scale of religious faith, Krochmal placed the plentitude of rationalist criticism of religion known in his time and religious permissiveness. He referred to materialism in this world. In reaction to the hallucination, there will come forth a denial that spiritual exists until those holding that view shall degrade the image of man and attribute his very soul and wonders of his powers to his bodily fluids and temperatures. And he wrote about deism that he called a lack of faith in the casting of doubt on every evidence of inner feeling and common sense, even on the tradition of our forefather, so much so that some will go so far as to give no credit to the existence of the faithful shepherd, our master Moses and his handing down of the Torah, or to the books of the prophecy, or even the Holy Spirit, saying perhaps they were composed by some fake rabbi. In these few sentences, Krochmal summed up the major position of religious skepticism and now placed them in contrast to the position that Hasidism represented in his view, in order to define the crisis in terms of as sharp as possible. What is worse for the individual and for the communities, he asked, atheism or vain, trivial belief? Krochmal was not the head of a movement, nor did he fill any position of leadership. Like his fellow members of the Haskalah, all he had in his disposal were books, writing materials, and plenitude of ideas. His solution for the crisis was entirely within the realm of the intellect, actually accessible only to a small elite of Jewish intellectuals whose language of culture was rabbinical Hebrew. In truth, he felt inferior because of his location in Galicia, and with a sense of frustration and despair, admitted to his own weakness. With what can I go forth to save my people? With the very little I possess to give them, what relief can that offer? Such things are of no use. And other than me, there are maskilim who may provide more Torah and sound wisdom than I can. I'm unable to bring new revelation. All the more so, since I had not passed through the course of learning in the academy as did the scholar of Germany. To sum up, Krochmal Intellectual Project was an inseparable part of the conservative shift taken by the Haskalah movement in the early 19th century. Moreh Nevuchei Hazman also was an attempt to rescue spirituality from materialism. Note that every religion faith is in the spiritual, he said, as well as to present the pure religion that Judaism, in his view, had created for all of humanity. He also sought to acknowledge the dynamic character of human history and the unique character of each national history, including the history of the Jewish nation. And when the moderate Haskalah, so concerned and striving to restore solidarity, called upon the right and the left to avoid dismantling Jewish identity and forsaking the tradition of their forefathers, he dialectically created the ideological infrastructure for modern nationalism. The consciousness of a national history that is capable of containing within it opposing groups and views, conflicts, struggles, constant change, when the spirit of the nation, a terminology of Krochmal, preserves its unity even when the internal conflicts are very profound, and when only a remarkable individual located in its middle are capable of seeing the picture in its entirety, the consciousness was at the heart of Krochmal's intellectual project that was set forth in his book. And this early formulation of historical nationalism, and then also a reflection of the schism that so troubled the conservative in Krochmal's generation, as well as his solution for the perplexed of his time. Perel, in contrast, never reached the same point that Krochmal did. His trust in the Kulturkampf to cast out the Hasidim and overcame, in a certain way, his hostility toward superficial modernization. The conservative maskilim were forced again and again to decide where to assign priority, to criticize the right that was identified with those who rejected everything modern, or to criticize the left that was identified with hyper-modernization. Sounds familiar to us, at least in my country, doesn't it? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shmuel, for such an amazing lecture from you. And right now we move to the questions and comments. So first, Professor Wodzinski, please, Martin.
Thank you. Shmuel, first of all, thank you for this most illuminating lecture, and also for the dialogue it establishes with what I said yesterday. I very much appreciate it. And I would like to, in kind of provocative way, pull you a bit further in this dialogue, because in what you presented, is in some way self-perception of the masculine, is their own picture of being the middle way between the extremes. But if you look from outside, you will always find those who will say, no, no, the masculine are far to the right or far to the left. We are the real middle path. So my question is, how far we accept this vision? Are they really the middle path? Or maybe the middle path was the people of Brody. They were the real middle path of the Jewish modernity. And the masculine was a small group of frustrated intellectuals on the right who were trying to preserve some values which were outdated by the time, and they did not stick to the community. Well, I'm trying to, maybe to be too provocative with such an expression, but simply put, how far we attribute the right diagnosis to what the masculine are saying. And also another element that I would like to ask, there is a lot of rhetorical kind of tropaic discourse in what you cited. This is what you can read in every generation about deterioration of generations. And if you read, for example, Lefin's essay, the French essay for the Polish Sejm, you read what he writes about Maimonides and Maimonides' disciples as exactly the same story. The same story of deterioration of generations. Maimonides established the right path, and his disciples took it to the left and went as far as almost in belief, right? So how far this is kind of rhetorical tool that, as you say, even today, we use very, very, very often, referring to kind of idyllic past that never existed, actually. Thank you.
So thank you, Marcin, for the opportunity to continue with our dialogue. Again, I didn't have the opportunity to comment yesterday on your wonderful talk, but of course it was also challenging, especially for scholars of the Haskalah. I believe that, of course, there were so many ways to become a modern Jew. And during the 19th century, I think that everybody on the Jewish spectrum became in his own way modern. It means involved in modern life and involved in the modern discourse. But there's something very unique about this group of masculine, that they actually were aware of being modern, and they wanted to lead Jewish modernity towards the way that they believe this is the right way. I mean, that they wanted to be actually leaders. They want to be intellectual leaders. They want to be a community leaders if they could. And in many cases during the 19th century, they became leaders of the communities. And of course, I presented the masculine through their self-image and by their rhetoric and discourse. First, because I believe that we should respect those people from the past and let them speak to us in their own voice, and not to impose our insights and thesis on them. And secondly, because I really believe that we can notice here a dramatic shift in the Haskalah when they realize, it came only from the beginning of 19th century, when they realized that in order to be relevant and to promote their own agenda for Jewish life, culture, and sometimes even religion, they need to oppose two, let's say, main opponents from the right and from the left. So when they believe that they are the people of the middle of the road, I want to believe them that that's the way they thought about themselves. And as at the time, there was no theory of secularization, they couldn't really put the presence of those, let's say, secular or semi-secular Jews of Brody and other trends of secularization and acculturation, they couldn't put them in the, let's say, binary model of the way they look at the Jewish world at the time. So they use the term Haskalah, but of course, and they say Haskalah mezuyefet, false, Haskalah pseudo masculine, because they didn't have any other term. Of course, those people in Brody were not masculine at all. And they identified between modern Jews and Haskalah, and they were very much confused. How could it be that there are other modern trends at the time? I think it's a very interesting process, and of course, in this case, we can look from above and explain what happened in other terms, like using secularization as a yardstick. I'm also very much aware that this narrative of deterioration of generations is very common. That didn't happen only at the beginning of the 19th century, and this rhetoric is well known. But still, as we are historians, I think that we can listen with much sensitivity to those voices, and I think that we can separate between, let's say, normal rhetoric and complaining about the gap between generation and something that is a lot more intense, and this is actually part of the general climate in Europe, not just among the Jews, of the huge crisis caused by the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. And they are still in the middle. There's so many evidences to this kind of confusion. And this is part of the embarrassment, the confusion that Krochmal talks about in his Moreh Nevochei Hazman. And there's another element which is really important, especially in order to understand Krochmal, that all those political, military events also cause a change in the historical consciousness of the people, and at least the intellectual were a lot more aware of the relativism of time. So historicism was emerging in early 19th century, and Krochmal was very much aware about it, found it as one of challenges to Jewish consciousness and philosophy.
Thank you very much.
I'm
Thank speaking as a devil advocate, so obviously I share most of your views on those issues, but I think it's very important to voice them. Thanks.
Thank you. There is one more question, and I guess the last one from Benjamin Brown. Please, Benny, please.
Thank you, Shmuel. It was really both informative and thought-provoking. And I have a small question, actually, kind of follow-up to Marcin's. Let me start with another example. Professor Yossi Salmon wrote about the Yechiel Michel Pines, and was once talking with him about him and asked him, I told him it was amazing that Pina started off as a rebel and was banned by the old Yishuv, and at the end of his life he finished up as a conservative and fought against the innovative movements. And Salmon answered me, Professor Salmon answered me that the most amazing thing is that he didn't change. He remained throughout his life almost in the same place. It was the ground beneath him that changed, that shifted to the left. He remained in the same place, but when he started off, that place was considered left, and at the end of his life, that same place was considered right, and even the extreme right was considered ultra-conservative at the end of his lifetime. And my question is, in that respect, as far as I could follow your lecture and all the examples, I think most, if not all of the cases you presented are exactly the same thing. They themselves didn't change. The ground underneath them moved left, so they were later on considered right. And here's the point where from comes my question. These are intelligent people who could really look back and had historical perspective. And now the question is that once they understood that they remained the same place, but the ground that actually they created ran far away left from them, is there any, at least slightest, at least smallest, at least marginal expression of remorse in that camp? I didn't hear even one voice of all the thinkers you presented of someone who was just saying, guys, we're wrong. We shouldn't have started this project at all from the outset. If it ran so far left, maybe we had to join the rabbis and didn't start anything at all. As far as I can understand, such voices were not raised. Am I right?
Yeah. Well, there is a famous example of a maskil from Galicia, Bic, who was one of the small group around the periodical that Letteris started to publish in Zholkva in 1824 at Sfira, and Bic was one of the prominent advocates of Haskalah, and then to the most surprise of his fellow maskilim, he turned and converted and became and he became like an advocate of Hasidism in a certain way. This is and of course I couldn't understand. So I can't give you more examples of maskilim who said no, we are wrong. But part of the crisis in the Berlin Haskalah in late 18th century was about maskilim who really lost faith in their project, and they saw that there are not so many subscribers to HaMeasef, and they gave up and they say, well, there's no way to change the situation. One of them was Solomon Maimon. He was also part of the maskilim in Berlin, and then he realized that this project in the Hebrew language is so limited and not so interesting for a brilliant mind like the one he had. So he left them to and he looked for other ways to express his desire for philosophy as a German philosopher. So there are some example, but you are absolutely right, and I agree with you. Mainly, they didn't change. The context has changed, as you said. The ground moved, and they were challenged, and they had to respond. But it wasn't, let's say, the natural way of life. When you are young, you are more militant. When you are older, you become more moderate and more conservative, because this conservative turn that I was speaking about, you can find it among younger gender maskilim and older maskilim. So it's not something about about generation. Zamoch, who wrote Toar Azman, for example, was very young when he wrote this very pessimistic family play. But again, if I can have the last word in this session of the conference, I hope that the message that I wanted to deliver here in my talk, that in contrast to the stereotypes, and we heard a lot about stereotypes in the research yesterday from Martin. So in contrast to the stereotypes, the masculine could also be the critics of modernity itself. It started with Moses Mendelssohn. I don't have the time to say more about it. He was one, let's say, of the first postmodernists, because he was very critical of modernity in his time. But in this case of the masculine in Galicia and other places in early 19th century, we can see them also as critique of modernity. And of course, the result is, the consequence is that in order to really understand the Haskalah, we should understand that they were the carriers of a very, very particular trend of modernity. And of course, we all know that the stereotypes, especially among the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, and Hasidim, is that everything that is modern is about masculine, and of course, that's not the right picture historically.
May I add just one more? Thank you for that. May I add just one more comment? Actually, the picture you're portraying here is not. It's quite similar to what happened in the entire European culture, because we at least the recent researchers say that we always judged Enlightenment as the harbinger of modernity. Well, then came the reaction. If you, I get it, in Hebrew we have Zev Sternhal's recent book, Anti-Enlightenment, but there are also other books by other authors who say actually what we call counter-revolution or counter-enlightenment is also a modern type of intellectual thought. It's no longer the pre-modern thought, definitely not the medieval thought. It's far off those trends. It's another type of modernity, and even romanticism that went against Enlightenment in the 19th century, nobody would say they might have considered themselves as anti-modern to some degree, but in a retrospective view, we all see that they were all moderns in their own way. It's a different path of modernity, not necessarily the enlightened one.
Yeah, I think that we agree, and I hope, and I'm sure that Martin also agrees with us, because this was, you know, the pattern of thinking that he presented yesterday. Yes, I really agree.
Dear Shmuel, thank you so much again for your lecture.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.